There's a particular kind of quiet that only exists on a train pulling into a town you used to know. Not silence. The wheels still hum against the rail. The intercom still crackles somebody's stop. A toddler 2 rows back is negotiating loudly with his mother about a snack. But a quiet underneath all of it. The kind that doesn't live in your ears so much as your chest. I hadn't seen Maple Hollow in 20 years. Not a visit, not a holiday, not even a funeral. Though there had been 2 I should have come back for and didn't. I'd built a whole life without this place. An apartment in the city that always smelled faintly of somebody else's cooking. A career that other people called impressive. A marriage that ended the way most marriages end. I've come to believe. Not with a slammed door, but with 2 people slowly running out of things to say to each other across a kitchen table. Until one Tuesday, the silence just becomes permanent. And now here I was, 48 years old, watching the New England countryside change color outside a train window, carrying back with me the only 2 things from that other life I intended to keep. Dad. Bella's voice, 12 years old and endlessly patient with me in a way I hadn't earned. You've been staring out the window since Albany. I'm looking at the trees, I said. Which was true, and also not the whole truth. Across the aisle, Luna didn't look up from her phone, thumb moving through a group chat with friends she'd already started missing, though she'd never admit it. 18, freshly graduated, entirely unconvinced that a town called Maple Hollow could hold anything worth finding. I didn't blame her for that. I'd felt exactly the same way once, in reverse, desperate to leave this place, certain that everything that mattered in the world was happening somewhere else, and that if I just ran fast enough toward it, I'd eventually catch up to the person I was supposed to become. The trees outside the window shifted from anonymous forest into something I recognized, piece by piece, like a song coming back to you mid-verse. A particular bend in the creek where I'd once lost a shoe. A red barn with a caved-in roof that had been caving in, as far as I could tell, since I was 9 years old and had considered it a permanent feature of the landscape, like a mountain. My chest did something complicated. Not quite grief, not quite relief. Something in between that didn't have a clean name. We're almost there, I said, mostly to myself. And Bella, without looking away from the window, reached over and put her hand briefly over mine, the way she'd started doing in the months since the divorce was finalized. A small, wordless check-in that she thought I didn't notice she was performing on a schedule. I noticed every time. The station hadn't changed, which somehow surprised me more than if it had. Same green paint peeling in the same 3 spots along the eaves. Same iron clock mounted above the ticket window, 5 minutes slow, exactly as it had been my entire childhood. As if time itself had quietly agreed, long ago, to wait a little for stragglers, and had simply never gotten around to correcting itself. Bella was out of her seat before the train had fully stopped, pressing her face to the glass with the unself-conscious enthusiasm only a 12-year-old can still manage in public. "It smells like leaves," she announced the second the doors opened, which wasn't something you could actually know from inside a train car. But I understood exactly what she meant in the moment we stepped onto the platform. That particular October smell of wood smoke and damp earth, and something sweeter underneath it, apples maybe, or cider going on somewhere close. Luna followed more slowly, hauling her suitcase down the metal steps like it owed her money and she intended to collect. "So this is it," she said, surveying the platform with a flat, assessing look she'd perfected sometime around 15. 2 benches, a hanging basket of flowers gone dry and papery with the season. An old man reading a folded newspaper who glanced up at us with the particular, unhurried attention small towns give to anyone new. "This is it," I confirmed, and felt, for one disorienting second, like I was introducing my daughters to a person rather than a place. Past the station fence, on the street beyond, a woman in a green coat was steadying an elderly woman's grip on 2 overloaded paper bags of apples that had begun splitting at the bottom. Catching a rolling apple before it hit the pavement with the quick, practiced ease of someone who'd done this exact thing 100 times before. I didn't get a clear look at her face, dark hair, quick hands already turning the corner, before Bella's voice pulled me back. "Dad?" She was 3 feet away already, waiting on me to catch up with the bags. I turned to follow her and didn't think about it again. While I wrestled our bags off the train, 3 suitcases, 1 duffel, a cardboard box of books I hadn't been willing to ship, Bella wandered toward the far end of the platform, crouching down to examine something wedged in the gap between 2 weathered boards. "Dad, look." She held up a small brass key when I reached her. Tarnished nearly black with age, no tag, no chain, no explanation of any kind. Just a key that had once belonged to some door somewhere, and had apparently spent years, decades maybe, waiting patiently in a crack in a train platform for somebody curious enough to look down. Probably fell out of somebody's pocket. "Could be nothing," I said. "Everything's something," Bella said with total seriousness, and pocketed it before I could argue further. And I felt the strange, dislodging sensation of being 12 years old myself again, standing on this exact platform, believing precisely the same thing about the world. That if you paid close enough attention, it would hand you its secrets on purpose. The house was smaller than I remembered, which is what always happens when you return to the places that raised you. Memory inflates everything, makes ceilings higher and rooms wider than they ever actually were. It stood exactly where I'd left it. 3rd house past the old schoolhouse. White clapboard with green shutters, a wraparound porch that leaned very slightly to the left, the way it always had, as though the whole structure were listening for something down the road. My grandmother had left the house to me 8 years ago, and in all that time, I had never once come back to see it. I'd hired a property manager to keep the pipes from freezing every winter, paid the taxes by automatic transfer, and told myself, with the particular efficiency of a man avoiding something, that this counted as taking care of it. The key, the real one, the one I actually owned, worn smooth on one edge from my grandmother's thumb, stuck in the lock exactly the way it always had. I had to lift the door slightly on its hinges to get it to turn, an old trick my hands remembered a full second before my mind caught up and supplied the memory of why. Inside, dust motes suspended in the slanted afternoon light. The particular smell of cedar and old paper that I would have recognized blindfolded anywhere in the world. And my grandmother's handwriting, still visible on a wall calendar from the year she died. Stopped forever on a Tuesday in March, a small grocery list still legible in blue ink. Butter, thread, birthday card for Kay. That last one hit harder than I expected. I hadn't been able to make it to her funeral. Deadline, I'd told everyone. It had even been true. Luna stood in the doorway a long moment, like she was deciding whether to formally commit to entering. "This is where we're living." "For now," I said. "For how long is for now?" It was a fair question, and I didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound like an admission of something I wasn't ready to admit yet. So I said nothing useful, and Bella filled the silence the way she always did, walking straight past both of us to the old upright piano in the corner and pressing a single key, testing, with real gravity, whether the house still had a voice. It did, slightly out of tune, still, unmistakably, a voice. We spent the rest of that first afternoon opening windows that stuck, coaxing stubborn faucets back to life, and discovering, room by room, the small accumulated evidence of a woman who had lived carefully and without waste. A drawer of neatly folded dish towels, ironed even though no one would ever see them ironed. A shoebox of buttons sorted by color, a Bible with a pressed flower marking Psalm 23, brittle as a moth's wing. Luna found her way, eventually, to the upstairs bedroom that had once been mine, standing in the doorway with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This was your room?" she said. Not a question. "A long time ago." There's still a poster outline on the wall, sun-faded where something used to hang. "A band nobody remembers anymore," I said, and she almost smiled. The first almost smile I'd seen from her since we'd left the city. Before catching herself and retreating back into her careful, guarded neutrality, as though even that small crack in her armor had been an accident she intended to correct. In the small back parlor, wedged between a bookshelf and the cold fireplace, I found my grandmother's old roll-top writing desk exactly where it had always stood. It was, as it had been my entire childhood, locked, a small brass keyhole set into the front panel, the kind of lock that expects a very particular, very old key. I tried the obvious places out of pure habit. Under the blotter, taped behind the wall clock, inside the empty sugar tin in the kitchen. Nothing. Whatever she'd kept inside it, and I remembered distantly the corner of a leather journal glimpsed once as a boy before being shooed out of the room, she'd apparently kept locked away even from herself, right up until the end. I gave the drawer one more useless tug and told myself it didn't matter. It didn't feel like it didn't matter. That first night, once the girls were finally asleep, Bella almost instantly, the way only children can drop into sleep in strange beds, as though exhaustion were simpler for them. Luna much later, I could see the blue glow of her phone leaking under her door well past midnight. Some conversation with the friends she'd left behind that I chose not to interrupt. I sat alone on the porch with 2 mugs of instant coffee, and no one left to hand the second one to. It was an old habit I hadn't managed to break. 16 years of marriage teaches your hands a rhythm they don't easily unlearn. 2 mugs from the cabinet, 2 spoons of sugar measured without thinking, and only afterward, standing there in an unfamiliar kitchen holding both. The small, stupid ache of remembering there was no one to give the second one to anymore. The porch swing still had the same creak, a specific 2-note groan I could have picked out of 100 porch swings blindfolded. I used to sit right here as a teenager, 17 years old and utterly certain the whole world was elsewhere. College, cities, a life made of consequence and applause. The kind of life nobody in Maple Hollow, as far as I could tell at 17, had ever managed to build for themselves. I'd made myself a promise on this exact swing, so solemn, I remember actually saying it out loud to the dark. I will not stay in Maple Hollow. I will not become someone who stayed. 20 years later, I sat in the same spot, having become, by every metric I used to respect, precisely the person I'd hoped to be. A published writer, a byline people recognized at dinner parties. And somehow, none of it had prepared me for a gray Tuesday afternoon in a lawyer's office 8 months ago, signing papers that quietly ended my marriage, and realizing afterward, standing on the courthouse steps in the rain, that I had absolutely nowhere I actually wanted to go. Except here. Except this porch, this creek, this dark. I didn't examine that thought too closely. Not yet. Not that first night. I finished both mugs of coffee, one after the other, and went inside before the cold could ask me any more questions I wasn't ready for. Bella found the bookstore before I did, which felt, somehow, exactly right. She'd slipped out to explore, while Luna and I unpacked boxes of kitchenware neither of us fully remembered owning, and came back an hour later smelling faintly of old paper, practically vibrating with a story. "There's a man there named Noah," she reported, dropping onto a kitchen chair still wrapped in bubble wrap. "Everyone calls him Grandpa Noah, even though he's not their actual grandpa. He gave me a book for free because he said I had good instincts." What does that mean? "It means he liked you," I said, and something in my chest recognized the name before the rest of me caught up. The bookstore itself, when I finally saw it in person 2 days later, was exactly the kind of place that shouldn't have survived 20 years of the world getting faster and colder towards small, stubborn businesses. And yet there it stood, warm light spilling out onto Oak Street through wavy old glass. The particular hush of a room crowded with unread pages, a brass bell over the door I remembered clearly from being 7 years old and being allowed, for the very first time in my life, to choose my own book without anyone standing over my shoulder. Noah looked up the moment the bell rang, and his eyes did the exact thing they'd always done to me as a boy. Landed on you with an unhurried, complete attention, as though he already knew the general shape of your story, and was simply, patiently, waiting for you to catch up to it yourself. "Kevin Whitmore," he said. Not quite a greeting, more a fact he was confirming aloud, like checking a name off a list he'd kept for a very long time. "Took you long enough?" "Noah." My voice came out rougher than I intended. "You look exactly the same." "I look precisely 20 years older," he said. "Same as this town, same as you, whether you're ready to admit it standing there or not." He came around the counter slowly, favoring one knee, and studied me the way you'd study a photograph you'd once known well, checking it against memory. "Come to stay, or come to visit?" "Honestly, I don't know yet." "Fair enough," Noah said, and didn't push it any further, which I would come to learn was exactly his particular gift, knowing precisely how far a person could be pushed on a given day, and stopping one question short of it every single time. He made 2 cups of tea without asking whether I wanted one, set one down across the counter from me, and busied himself reshelving a stack of returns while I drank it in silence. Grateful, in a way I didn't have words for yet, that he hadn't asked me a single question about the last 20 years. Instead, he told me, unprompted, about the store, how it had nearly closed twice. Once when the chain bookstore opened off the highway and folded within 3 years, and once when his hip first went bad and he couldn't manage the ladder to the top shelves anymore. until half the town had shown up unasked one Saturday with tools and paint and a new rolling ladder they'd built themselves. People don't let good things disappear here if they can help it, he said, not looking up from the shelf. Not always. Not everything gets saved. But more than you'd expect if you're paying attention. I didn't say anything, but I thought about that sentence for the rest of the day, turning it over the way I'd later turn over the one about roads. I told myself we'd be here 2 weeks. Enough time to clean out the house, decide whether to list it or keep it, get my bearings, and figure out where we actually belonged before committing to anything permanent. It was Bella who undid that plan entirely. 3 nights in, sitting cross-legged on the end of my bed, with the brass key still riding in her pocket. I could tell by the way her hand kept drifting to it absently, checking that it was still there, the way some people touch a necklace. "Can we stay for a while?" she asked. Like, actually stay. Not just the fix the house and leave kind of stay. "Bells, we have a whole life to figure out. Your school, my work, Luna's. We can figure it out here," she said, with the total, uncomplicated confidence of a 12-year-old who hadn't yet learned that adults usually need considerably more convincing than that to change course. I like it here. Everyone's nice to me, and they don't even know me yet. There's a lady at the bakery who gave me a free cookie for absolutely no reason today. That doesn't happen in the city. Nothing's free in the city. I wanted to tell her that the world doesn't actually work that way. That kindness offered to a stranger for no reason usually turns out to have a catch buried somewhere in it. But some stubborn, worn-down part of me. The part that had just spent the better part of a year sitting in rooms with lawyers, watching 2 decent people dismantle a life with careful, businesslike precision. Didn't actually believe that particular lesson anymore, and found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't want to teach it to her either. "Let me think about it," I said, which both of us understood, even as I said it, was already functionally a yes. Bella smiled like she'd known that too, kissed my cheek in the quick, embarrassed way she'd started doing since turning 12, old enough to think affection needed to be efficient, young enough to still offer it freely, and padded off to bed, leaving me alone with the porch light and a decision I hadn't technically made yet, but that had, somehow, already made itself. Luna's first morning at Maple Hollow University's law program arrived gray and cold, the specific kind of cold that makes a campus look older than it actually is. Ivy going copper at the edges, students moving fast between buildings with their collars turned up against the wind. Somebody's forgotten scarf snagged on a hedge. She'd expected, she told me later, to feel entirely like an outsider, a transfer student arriving mid-semester from a much larger, more prestigious school, dropped abruptly into a small-town law program that, if she was being honest with herself, which she usually was, even when it cost her, she'd privately assumed would feel like a step down, a consolation prize for a life that hadn't gone the way it was supposed to. Instead, a girl named Priya Anand sat down next to her in constitutional law, and within 10 minutes had loaned her a pen without being asked. Warned her in a fierce whisper which professor genuinely despised laptops in his lectures, and invited her to a study group that met most evenings at a diner called Hope Cafe, 3 blocks off campus, apparently famous for pie. "It's weird," Luna told me that night, picking at dinner with more energy than she'd shown in weeks. "Nobody's trying to network with me. Nobody's sizing me up to figure out if I'm useful to them. They're just talking to me, like I'm a person and not a resource to be evaluated. Is that weird? At my old school, it absolutely would have been. She stabbed a piece of chicken with more force than necessary, not from anger, I realized, but from the effort of processing something genuinely new. I don't know what to do with people who aren't calculating anything. I didn't say anything to that in the moment, but I filed it away carefully, the way I filed away most things that mattered. For a sentence I might write someday, or maybe just for myself, a private note to remember that my daughter, sharp and guarded as she'd become over the past difficult year, was quietly, cautiously learning the difference between a place that used people up and a place that simply, without agenda, welcomed them. Later that week, walking her to campus on a morning I didn't strictly need to, I asked what her professors were actually like, expecting the usual clipped assessment she gave everything new. Instead, she talked for 6 full blocks about a torts professor who told stories instead of lecturing, about a classmate who'd grown up on a dairy farm 20 minutes outside town and talked about property law like it was personal, because for him, apparently, it was. She stopped herself mid-sentence outside the law building, looking almost surprised at her own enthusiasm. "You don't have to stop talking," I said. "I know," she said, and didn't quite for another block. Bella came home from the bookstore on a Thursday, holding a paperback so old its spine had cracked cleanly into 3 separate pieces, held together barely, with a rubber band Noah had apparently supplied, along with a warning to be gentle. Tucked inside the back cover, wedged between the final pages and the binding, she'd found a photograph. "Grandpa Noah said I could keep the book," she said, holding it out to me with unusual care. "But he told me to show you the picture first. He said you'd know what it was." I took it from her before I fully understood why my hands had already gone careful, slow. The way you handle something you suspect might be fragile before you've confirmed it. 2 teenagers, 16 or 17 years old, sitting side by side on the hood of an old pickup truck, parked directly in front of this exact bookstore. The same brass bell visible above the door behind them. A boy who was unmistakably me. Thinner, unlined, entirely unbothered, laughing hard at something happening just outside the frame of the photograph. And beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, a girl with dark hair loose around her face and a wide, unguarded grin that I realized, with a small jolt, hadn't changed one bit in 30 years. Because I'd seen that exact same grin 4 days earlier at the general store, when I'd nearly walked straight into Lily Calloway, carrying 2 overloaded paper bags of groceries, and had managed, after an embarrassing pause, only her name. "Who's the girl?" Bella asked, already suspecting the answer, watching my face with the particular unblinking attention she reserved for things she considered important. "An old friend," I said. And even I could hear, out loud, how insufficient that word was for whatever this actually was. It wasn't until right then, staring at the photograph in my daughter's kitchen, that something else quietly clicked into place. The woman in the green coat outside the station our very first afternoon in town, steadying a stranger's spilling bag of apples while I'd been too busy wrestling suitcases to look twice. She'd been there before I'd even properly arrived. I just hadn't known yet what I was looking at. Bella didn't push that night, which was somehow worse than if she had. She just watched me carefully over dinner, the way she watched everyone lately, quietly collecting information, filing away the small, true things adults believed they were successfully hiding from a 12-year-old. "You liked her," she said finally, over the sound of Luna clearing plates. Not really a question. "It was a long time ago, Bells." "That's not a no." I put my fork down. Across the table, Luna had gone quiet too, pretending real absorption and wiping down the counter, but clearly listening to every word. "Lily and I grew up together," I said, choosing each word carefully, the way you choose footing on ice you're not sure will hold you. "We were close, best friends for a while, and then something more than that. And then I left for college, told myself I'd come back, and then 1 year quietly became 5, and 5 became this." I gestured vaguely, encompassing 20 years' worth of not coming back. All of it collapsed into one tired motion of my hand. "That's the whole story." "It's not the whole story," Bella said, with the terrible, unerring clarity children sometimes manage without even trying. "It's just the part you're willing to say out loud tonight." I didn't have an answer for that, not one I trusted myself to say, without it turning into something bigger than either of us was ready for at a kitchen table on a Tuesday. I cleared the rest of the plates instead, scraping and stacking with more focus than the task required. And both my daughters let me retreat into it, which was, I understood even then, its own small and deliberate mercy. The whole town, it seemed, turned out for the harvest dinner on the green. Long tables draped in red checkered cloth, end to end across the grass, string lights strung between the old oaks, and glowing gold as the sky went dark. The thick smell of wood smoke and simmering apple cider settling over everything like a blanket. Grandpa Noah found me hiding, more or less successfully, by the dessert table, where I'd retreated from a conversation with a well-meaning neighbor I didn't yet have the energy for. "You look like a man bracing for something," he observed, helping himself to a slice of pie without asking permission, which I got the sense he never did. "Just recalibrating." He nodded slowly, the way he seemed to do everything, with a patience that made you feel, oddly, like you had all the time in the world. "Some roads only make sense when you walk them twice," he said, not explaining it, simply handing the sentence over the way he'd handed Bella that book, as though it were a gift he trusted me to grow into eventually. "First time through, you're just trying to get somewhere. Second time, you finally notice what was actually along the way the whole time." I turned the sentence over in my mind, not entirely sure yet what to do with it, tucking it away with the other things Noah had said to me that I suspected I'd understand better in retrospect than I did in the moment. Across the green, Bella was crouched at the creek's edge, teaching a boy her age the precise wrist flick required to skip stones, narrating the physics of it with total confidence she almost certainly didn't possess. Luna was laughing. Actually laughing, head thrown back, an unguarded sound I hadn't heard from her in months. With Priya near the cider station, and nearby, in a green wool coat with her arms wrapped loosely around herself against the evening chill. Lily was watching the whole scene with an expression I couldn't quite read from that distance. She caught me looking. She didn't look away. Earlier, before any of that, Noah had pulled me aside near the pie table to introduce me properly to Officer Ryan. Broad-shouldered, close-cropped gray at the temples. The kind of handshake that told you exactly how seriously he took the gesture. "Heard you've got 2 girls settling in." Ryan said, not quite smiling, but not unfriendly either. This town looks after its kids. You'll see. Behind him, I watched him catch Bella's eye across the green and give her a small, formal nod, the kind you'd give an adult, which she returned with visible delight, standing a little straighter for it. Grace, from the bakery, the one who'd given Bella the free cookie, found me by the cider station not long after, thanking me, oddly, for something I hadn't done. Your daughter told my Emily she liked her drawings, Grace said. Emily's been quiet since we moved here. First time she's talked about school without me having to drag it out of her. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded, filing away one more small proof of the thing Bella seemed to understand instinctively, and I was only now beginning to relearn. She found me later, near the water, where I'd wandered off alone to think, the noise of the dinner fading behind me into a warm, distant hum. You always did that, Lily said, coming to stand beside me at the water's edge, close enough that I caught the faint scent of cider and wood smoke still clinging to her coat. Disappear right when things got interesting. I prefer to call it strategic retreat. You would. She smiled, and for one disorienting second, the 20 years between us folded up neatly like a letter and put themselves quietly away. I heard you're staying in the old Whitmore house. For now. That's exactly what you said the last time, she said, right before you left. There was no bitterness in it at all, just a fact, laid down carefully and evenly between us. Like she wanted me to know precisely, without accusation, how long her memory of "for now" had actually lasted. I was 17 and stupid, I said. I thought leaving here was the same thing as becoming somebody. I thought staying meant settling. And now? I looked out at the dark water, at the old wooden bench someone, my grandfather, I thought, though I couldn't be certain anymore, had built decades ago right at the edge of the dock, weathered gray and solid, clearly still cared for by someone in town who mowed the grass around its legs. Now I think I spent 20 years successfully becoming somebody, and somewhere along the way, forgot to notice I wasn't actually happy doing it. Lily didn't say anything for a long moment, letting the water and the distant music fill the space instead. Then, quietly, I'm glad you're back, Kevin. Whatever it was that finally brought you, even if what brought me was a divorce. Especially if it was a divorce, she said, without flinching from the word the way most people did around me lately. It means you're finally telling the truth about something you spent a long time avoiding. I'd rather have you here honest than somewhere else pretending. Despite the easy morning with Priya, Luna's second week at Maple Hollow University hit its first real snag in property law, when she raised her hand with an answer that was technically, defensibly correct and got laughed at anyway. Not cruelly, not really. Just carelessly. The way 18-year-olds sometimes are with each other, without quite meaning the damage they cause. And it landed harder than it probably should have. She didn't tell me about it directly. She told Bella, in the low, private voice of two sisters who had learned to trust each other with things they weren't ready to hand to an adult yet. And Bella, who has never once in her life successfully kept anything from me for longer than about a day, told me anyway, unable to bear the weight of it alone. I found Luna on the porch that night, wrapped tight in our grandmother's old patchwork quilt, staring out at the dark street like it owed her an explanation. I heard property law was rough today, I said, settling into the swing beside her. Bella has a big mouth. Bella loves you fiercely. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Luna was quiet for a long moment, picking at a loose thread on the quilt's edge. I used to be the smart one everywhere I went, she said finally, quieter than I was used to hearing from her. The one people deferred to. Here I'm just new, unproven. Nobody knows yet what I'm actually capable of, and I have to just sit in that without anything to point to. Nobody in a small town ever knows what you're capable of at first. I said carefully. That's not a punishment, Luna, even though I know it feels like one right now. That's just the cost of actually being known here eventually, instead of just being impressive on arrival. She didn't answer right away, but she also didn't ask me to leave, which from Luna lately was its own quiet form of agreement. And after a moment, without either of us commenting on it, she shifted the quilt so half of it covered my knees too. Bella discovered the animal shelter the way she discovered nearly everything worth finding, by wandering somewhere she technically wasn't supposed to go unsupervised, and ending up exactly where she needed to be. The dog was old, gray thick around the muzzle, and had been there, according to the exhausted-looking volunteer at the front desk, longer than any other animal currently in residence. 8 full months, passed over again and again by families who wanted something younger, something that photographed better, something with more obvious years ahead of it. Nobody wants him because he's not a puppy anymore, Bella told me later that afternoon, sitting cross-legged on the concrete shelter floor with the dog's graying head resting heavily in her lap, entirely unconcerned about the state of her genes. But he's the gentlest one here. I checked every single kennel. I have a system. We just moved into a house we don't even technically know if we're keeping yet, I said, already sensing, with the particular dread of a parent who's lost this exact argument before, that I was going to lose it again. That's exactly why he needs somewhere steady, Bella said, with the airtight, unassailable logic of a child who has already privately won the argument and is simply patiently waiting for the adult in the room to catch up to the obvious conclusion. So do we, Dad. So do all 3 of us, if we're being honest. I looked down at the dog. The dog looked back up at me with the patient, unhurried expression of a creature that had learned a long time ago not to expect very much from people, and was quietly, cautiously hoping, without quite daring to show it, that this particular afternoon might prove that assumption wrong. We named him Franklin, after nobody in particular, just because the name suited the steady, unbothered way he settled himself immediately into the back seat of the car, like he'd always belonged there. He came home with us that same afternoon, and by dinner had already claimed the exact center of the kitchen rug as though it had been reserved for him decades ago. The shelter volunteer, a college kid named Marcus, who clearly hadn't expected the old dog to go home with anyone that week, walked us out to the car and lingered a moment at the window after we'd loaded Franklin in. People always want the story to be about the dog getting lucky, he said, but it's usually the other way around. You'll see. I thought about that the whole drive home. Franklin's steady breathing audible from the back seat, Bella's hand resting on his flank the entire way, as though she were afraid he might disappear if she stopped touching him. An email arrived on a Wednesday morning that I read 4 separate times before I fully accepted it wasn't some kind of mistake. A well-regarded magazine back in the city, offering me a regular column, steady work, genuinely good money. Exactly the sort of validation 17-year-old me had left Maple Hollow chasing in the first place, all those years ago. Certain that this was what it meant to have made it. I sat with the email for 2 full days without telling anyone it existed. It wasn't really about the money in the end. It was the old, familiar voice underneath the offer. The one that had trailed me through my entire adult life, without my quite noticing how loud it had gotten, insisting that a man's worth got measured out in bylines and masthead credits, that staying anywhere too long, even somewhere as unexpectedly gentle as this, was its own quiet form of failure, dressed up as contentment. I mentioned it to Noah eventually, back at the bookstore on a slow, rainy afternoon, because he had a particular way of listening that made confession feel less like weakness. Take it, if it'll genuinely make you happy, he said simply, not looking up from the ledger he was balancing behind the counter. That's not very wise, old mentor of you, Noah. I'm not here to talk you out of your own life, Kevin. Never have been, never will be. He set down his pen, and for a moment something older and heavier passed behind his eyes, the shopkeeper's ease dropping away entirely. I used to be. Once. My nephew Sam wanted to leave for art school years back. Must be nearly 20 years now, come to think of it. Funny how that number keeps following you around this town. I was scared of losing one more person, so I told him staying was the wiser road. He stayed, resented me for it a little more every year I could see it, and pretended not to. Left anyway, eventually, after a fight neither of us has ever properly apologized for. Haven't spoken since. 15 years this Christmas. He picked the pen back up, turned it over once, set it down again. So, no, I don't hand out directions anymore. I just try to ask the right question and get out of the way of the answer. I hadn't expected that. And it must have shown on my face, because Noah gave a small, tired shrug, the kind of gesture that had clearly done a lot of work over a lot of years. Everybody in this town looks half a saint from a distance, he said. Get close enough and you'll find the same cracked places as anywhere else. I'm here to ask you one honest question, and you don't have to answer it out loud to me. When's the last time achievement itself actually made you happy, versus just made you feel like you'd finally earned the right to rest for a while? I didn't have an answer ready. Sitting there in the warm, book-crowded quiet, watching rain streak the old glass windows, I realized that the absence of an answer was, itself, answer enough. There's a tree at the edge of town that everyone in Maple Hollow treats with a strange, entirely unspoken reverence. An ancient maple, easily 200 years old by Noah's estimation. Its trunk wide enough around that, as children, Lily and I used to be able to hide from each other on opposite sides of it and never once get found, no matter how loudly the other one called out. I went there alone, the morning after the email, needing somewhere to sit and think that wasn't crowded with other people's careful opinions about what I should do. I found a mark low on the trunk, half swallowed by 20 years of steady growth. Bark folding slowly over it, the way skin closes over an old scar. 2 sets of initials, carved deep by 2 teenagers who had believed, however briefly and however foolishly, that some things could be made permanent if you just cut them deep enough into something old enough to outlast you both. KW plus LC. I put my palm flat against the bark, directly over the letters, the way you'd check for a pulse on something you weren't entirely sure was still alive. Some roads only make sense when you walk them twice. I understood the sentence fully now. Standing there, not as borrowed wisdom handed down from an old man behind a counter, but as something true I'd stumbled into entirely on my own, the way you sometimes only recognize a lesson once you're already living inside it. The first time I'd walked away from this tree, at 17, I genuinely believed I was running toward a life. This time, standing here at 48, with my palm against a scar I'd carved myself, I finally understood that I hadn't come back to Maple Hollow running away from anything at all. I'd come back running from the much narrower, much lonelier possibility of becoming someone who never returned. I drafted the acceptance email that same night, sitting at the kitchen table long after both girls had gone to bed. Professional, appropriately grateful. The exact kind of message designed to close one door quietly and efficiently, so cleanly that it never has to be examined too closely by the person sending it. I didn't send it. Instead, I sat out on the porch. The same swing, the same familiar two-note creak, and thought honestly about the last 20 years, maybe for the first time in all of them, about how much of my adult life I'd spent carefully constructing a version of myself specifically designed to be admired by people I would likely never actually sit down to dinner with. About how not one of those distant, admiring readers had ever once brought me coffee I hadn't explicitly asked for, or found a rusted brass key on a train platform and decided, with zero supporting evidence, that it obviously meant something important. Franklin ambled over unprompted and lay down heavily across my feet, entirely certain of his welcome, the way dogs simply are once they've decided a place is theirs. From inside the house, faintly, I could hear Luna and Bella arguing cheerfully through a closed door about whose turn it actually was to walk him first thing in the morning. A small, ordinary, entirely unremarkable domestic sound, and that I realized, sitting there in the cold with a dog's weight warm against my ankles, I had been quietly starving for without ever having a name to put to the hunger. I deleted the draft before I could talk myself back into it. I asked them directly, over pancakes on Saturday morning, trying and mostly failing to sound casual about a question that wasn't casual in the slightest. If we left, went back to the city, I mean, what would you actually miss? Bella answered immediately, like she'd been rehearsing the list for days in case I ever asked. Franklin, obviously. Grandpa Noah. The lady at the bakery who gives free cookies for no reason. The creek. Priya for Luna, even though she'd pretend she wouldn't miss her at all. Luna threw a balled-up napkin across the table at her without bothering to deny it. And you? Bella added, quieter now. Syrup forgotten on her fork. You laugh here. You didn't used to, not really, not at home. I noticed. Luna took longer to answer, turning her fork over slowly in her hands, working something out as she spoke. I used to think being impressive was the entire point of everything, she said finally. Here, I'm just Luna. Not automatically the smartest person in whatever room I walk into. Just a person in a room full of other people who are also actually trying at their own things in their own ways. I think I'd miss that. A lot more than I expected to, honestly. I hadn't expected either answer to land quite the way both of them did. Sitting there at that small kitchen table with syrup going sticky on 3 plates and a dog waiting hopefully underneath for scraps. Okay, I said. And both of them looked up at once, understanding, before I'd even finished the single word. Exactly what I was quietly agreeing to. Bella whooped and nearly knocked over the syrup. Luna, more composed, just smiled down at her plate for a long moment before looking up. "You already knew what we were going to say," she said. "Why'd you even ask?" "Because I needed to hear you say it," I admitted. "Not guess it. Actually hear it out loud from both of you before I let myself believe it was real and not just something I wanted badly enough to imagine." Luna considered that, then reached over and stole the last piece of bacon off my plate without asking, which from her, I'd come to understand, was its own quiet form of "I love you, and I'm glad we're staying." I brought Lily to the maple tree the following evening. The first time I'd shown anyone the initials since I'd rediscovered them myself. Standing there alone with my hand pressed to bark like a man checking for a pulse. She traced the letters slowly with 2 fingers, quiet for a long moment, the evening light going soft and amber around both of us. "I used to come here sometimes, after you left," she admitted eventually. "Not often. Just often enough to remind myself I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I'm sorry it took me 20 years to come find you again. You're not the only one who left things unfinished, Kevin." She let her hand drop from the bark, turning to face me fully. "I built an entire company convincing myself that being needed by absolutely everyone was the same thing as being truly known by even one person. It isn't, not even close. I think I finally figured that out somewhere around the same time you left, and then just never quite got around to fixing it." "Maybe we fix it now," I said. "Both of it. Together, if you're willing." "Maybe," she said, and the word carried more genuine hope in it than certainty, which felt, somehow, exactly right for 2 people our age attempting something this fragile a second time around, with 2 decades of separate lives to account for and no guarantee that fragile things survive a second attempt at all. We stood there together a while longer beneath the old tree, her hand eventually finding mine without either of us formally announcing the gesture out loud. The ancient maple keeping its same old, patient witness over both versions of us. The 2 reckless teenagers who'd carved those letters believing they'd last forever. And the 2 careful, weathered adults standing here now, hoping, quietly, that they might. I told Noah first, the very next morning, mostly because it was clear, from the particular look on his face when I walked in, that he'd already known before I did. "We're staying," I said, standing in the doorway with the bell still swinging faintly above me. "Really staying, Noah. Not for now. Not some open-ended experiment. Staying." "I know," he said, and smiled the exact smile of a man who had, in fact, already quietly set aside a book he thought Bella might especially like for her birthday, 3 full months away, as though the outcome had genuinely never once been in serious doubt to him. I told the girls formally that evening, though by then the news barely needed saying out loud. Luna had already asked Priya, unprompted, about spring semester off-campus housing options, and Bella had already begun negotiating, without any preamble at all, for a second dog, on the entirely reasonable grounds that Franklin needs a friend his own age, Dad. He gets lonely when we're at school. And I told Lily, last of all, on the phone, late that night, the particular kind of call where the actual information stops mattering almost immediately. And it's really just about the sound of each other's voice, unhurried, with nowhere else either of us needed to be. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "I know," she said, and I could hear the smile in it clearly, even over the phone. "You never really were, Kevin. It just took you 20 years to walk back far enough to finally notice that for yourself." Word traveled fast, the way it does in a town this size. By the next morning, Grace had left a bag of cookies on the porch rail with a note that just said, "Welcome home," for real this time. Officer Ryan, out on his usual patrol, slowed his cruiser alongside me as I walked Franklin down Oak Street and rolled down the window just long enough to say, "Good. Kids need somewhere that stays put," before driving on. As though that settled something between us that hadn't needed further discussion. That night, once the house had finally gone quiet, Bella asleep with Franklin curled heavily at the foot of her bed, Luna's light finally clicking off down the hall, the small brass key sitting, still entirely unexplained, on the windowsill exactly where Bella had solemnly decided it belonged. I sat on the porch one more time with my notebook, the same battered one I've carried in one form or another since I was younger than Luna is now. I don't always know what I'm going to write until the pen is already moving across the page, following some instinct a half step ahead of conscious thought. Tonight, for once, it came easy. The words arriving already assembled, like they'd been waiting patiently for me somewhere just out of reach this whole time. Coming home was never really about the town itself. It was about finally being willing to be found by the people who knew you before you learned how to hide, and by the parts of yourself you left behind years ago while you were busy trying to become someone worth admiring instead of someone worth knowing. Some roads only make sense when you walk them twice. I think tonight, I finally understand why. I closed the notebook slowly and sat there a while longer in the cool dark, listening to the ordinary sounds of a town settling into sleep around me. On my way up to bed, I stopped in the back parlor without entirely deciding to. My grandmother's roll-top desk sat where it always had, patient, locked, indifferent to 20 years of my not asking about it. The little brass key was still on the windowsill in Bella's room. I'd have to go get it, I told myself, already crossing the hall to do exactly that, quiet enough not to wake her, lifting it from the sill where she'd left it like something sacred. Back at the desk, I fit the key into the small brass keyhole. It slid in clean, no resistance at all, as though the lock had been waiting the same 20 years I had. I turned it half an inch and felt something inside give way with a soft, final click. Unmistakably open now. Whatever was inside finally within reach. I didn't turn it the rest of the way. I sat there a long moment with my hand still on the key, my grandmother's careful handwriting on that stopped calendar suddenly very present in my mind. Butter, thread, birthday card for Kay. And understood, without being able to fully explain it, even to myself, that whatever she'd kept locked in there deserved to be opened on a night when I was ready to actually sit with it. Not a night when I was simply relieved to have finally found the right key. "Not tonight," I said out loud, to no one, and left the key turned exactly halfway, unlocked but unopened, and went up to bed. Somewhere down the street, the old church clock struck 11, 5 minutes slow, exactly as it always had been for as long as I could remember. As if it too had simply been waiting all this time, patient and unbothered, for me to come back around and finally notice. Some things I was beginning to understand were worth saving for the second time you walk the road.